Everyone. This week I want to talk about line breaks in poetry. I apologize if my voice echoes at all. There's a lot of traffic outside of my office, so I'm out in like the main hallway in the building where my office is, and because of COVID, it's pretty empty. I think I'm the only one here on Mondays, so it may echo a little bit, but it's better than not being able to hear me because of traffic. But yeah, so let's get started. So before we talk about how lines are broken, let's talk about what they are. We talked about, if you remember from the video, from the most recent video, the line is how poetry is written. It's basically a line of text on the page, which is pretty self-explanatory. Now, where we decide to break the line is what separates poetry from prose. Prose, the lines just flow all the way across the page until they run out of space, and then it goes to the next. And where a line breaks in prose isn't a big deal because it just breaks because of space. We're used to reading it as sentences and paragraphs. In poetry, we read the lines, and that's where we find the meaning. And where we decide to break a line, so where we decide to end a line and then start it on the next line, is pretty deliberate. And it that's how we create meaning and form and structure in two different ways that lines are broken. The first is end stopped, which is what it sounds like. The line ends at the end of a line. It's usually a natural grammatical pause or the ending of a thought. Usually there's some punctuation there, a comma, a period, something like that. Enjambment, on the other hand, is when the line breaks in the middle of a thought. Whereas with end stop, usually the thought is complete. With an enjambment, it's where you're breaking the line in the middle of a thought. Let's look at some examples. And the example for an end stop line is from a song lyric, just because a lot of rhyming poetry and songs tend to have end stop lines. We have blackbird singing in the dead of night. That's the end of that thought. And there's a comma there, so it ends at that comma. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. That's the end of a sentence. All your life, comma, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. On the other hand, here's Harlem by Langston Hughes, which is enjambment. What happens to a dream deferred? Now that first line is an end stop line, which is really interesting that he uses both in this. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? That line there, that was all one thought. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? But he broke it in the middle. Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Which is another end stop line. Or does it crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. And then again, he ends on an end stop line. Or does it explode? And here he's using that to kind of create some emphasis. It's he's not trying to create as much of, even though he does have a rhyme scheme, which is unusual a lot of times with rhyming poetry, they're end stopped, but not always. Here he's not paying as much attention to rhythm and pacing as he is with trying to get his images across. An end stop line is more common in rhyming poetry, like I said. And it's more common in classic poetry or poetry adhering to a strict form, a sonnet, for example, a sonnet. And I'll provide a source for poetic forms this week. But basically, it gives rhythm. It's usually a pretty consistent rhythm. And it slows down the speed, and it gives a clear idea of each line. So it's easy to see where one thought begins and ends because it's all on one line. And it creates regularity. Sometimes they may be more coherent and accessible. You can ponder on those sentences because you don't have to do the work of figuring out why it ends when it does. And it's usually easier to maybe explore some deeper meanings. Although I don't necessarily agree with this full example, I think it gives an idea of why someone may choose to end stop their line. Enjambment, on the other hand, this GIF is from Rocky Horror Picture Show. If you haven't seen it, I'm probably dating myself. But basically, there's this thing where he says it makes you shiver with antissa, and he stops. And then he says, patient. And she's like, oh, okay. And that's what you create with enjambment, that feeling. Your thought is overflowing across the lines. It feels, maybe sometimes it may feel a little bit more like prose, but it also creates this feeling of fluidity, but also can add complexity. It can build something more complex, a more complex narrative. You can have a longer thought if you don't have to complete it all in a line, but it can also create anticipation. What comes next? Why is this breaking how it does? And it builds a little bit of tension that way. And it gives you a little bit more control. It's more common in more experimental or free verse poetry, which is poetry that's not adhering to a form. It gives you emphasis. You choose to end and break a line on the words that you want to emphasize the most. It can lead to some ambiguity or some contradiction. In that a line can go across, and like you can say something and then contradict it in the next line. And then also it can give you more of a varied rhythm and pacing, whereas in-stop poetry seems to have a more consistent rhythm. And either one is fine. It just depends on how you are writing your poem and what type of experience you want to create for your reader. And enjambment can also be really experimental. One way to do that is through stair-step enjambment, which I think is the term. I was having a hard time finding the exact poetic term, but this is one that we've used in some of my poetry classes before. Basically, you're using enjambment on your line ends. And the lines after that line, you will often have irregular spacing. Sometimes they will be tabbed over. And it can create some movement and even more emphasis. There may be a lot of spacing in between lines here to create a lot of emphasis. The poet E.E. Cummings uses this a lot. And one of my favorite poems, which is a selection from a book-length poem, The Black Maria, by Araceli Germain. And this is, in this point, she's talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson, and you'll read this poem this week. It's one of my absolute favorite poems. And she's using this stair-step enjambment. As you can see, it kind of tabs over every other line, and at least in some sections, it doesn't in the entire poem, to create a lot more movement. She also, I like this poem because she also tends to use parentheses to create these parenthetical asides, which is more common with prose, especially in creative nonfiction. But here she's using it in prose, which I think is really fascinating. And she's here, her enjambment, I think, helps to create more of a movement and it creates a lot of tension. The Skyview Apartments, circa 1973, a boy is kneeling on the rooftop, a boy who, it is important to mention here, his skin is brown, prepares his telescope, the weights and rods, to better see the moon. His neighbor, it is important to mention here that she is white, calls the police because she suspects the brown boy of something. She does not know what at first, then turns, with her looking, his telescope into a gun, his duffel into a bag of objects thieved from the neighbors' houses, maybe even hers, and the police. It is important to mention that statistically they are also white, arrive to find the boy who has been turned by now into the suspect on the roof. And this poem continues. It's quite a long poem. But here she uses that enjambment to create that tension and that movement. And it gives her more control over how long her thoughts can be. This is a very long thought in this scene. And it's very much a scene like you would maybe see in a story. And it's a true story. But she's using this enjambment to build that tension. And then she wants to build that tension even more by the use of parentheticals to give some acknowledgement to things that are kind of going on underneath the story. Whereas we may just see a boy who's on the roof with a telescope and his neighbor is afraid it's a gun. Through the use of parentheticals, she's building even more tension to show you what's really going on underneath the surface, that there's this preconceived notion about what a young Black boy would be doing on the roof. with a backpack full of things. And I think if she had used a more traditional form, I don't think she could have gotten those thoughts across quite as well. So to wrap up, we create we create meaning in poetry through the line, through the use of lines. And where we break our lines, that's what dictates the form or structure of our poem. End stop lines are more common in stricter poetic forms, and also classic poetry and some rhyming poetry, whereas enjambment is more common in free verse poetry, which is poetry that doesn't stick to a traditional form. And experimenting with enjambment, as in the stair-step example, can heighten the potential of enjambment, and you can go even further than that stair-step. I hope this was a good quick lesson and overview over the line breaks, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Happy writing.